start. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كلامه المجيد واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا صدق الله العظيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum everyone. It gives me great privilege to be here with you virtually with Sayyid Imam Razawi. We did our first event last year, which was a very different world from where we are now. But alhamdulillah, it was a very groundbreaking kind of event where we had a lovely discussion, a very open discussion about things. So the plan for this evening, in fact, is to go past the kind of basic stuff and look slightly deeper and scratch into the historical traditions and the history of the engagement between the ulama of Ahlul Sunnah and Ahlul Shia. In particular, our tradition of mantiq and kalam that we actually have. If you do a simple Google search on Sunni and Shi'ism, you'll have 100 articles explaining what the differences, what the divides are. Now we have non-Sunnis and non-Shias who have almost become experts on this, trying to tell us what it is. And I think it's become an industry which has profited many people actually on the divide. If you were to Google on the Sunni-Shia engagement, you wouldn't really find much about it. So I think we understand how things fit in politically. So inshallah today, and Imam Razawi, one of our aims is actually just to scratch the surface and to go to our intellectual tradition and see how the ulama took from one another. And the tradition was very live. It wasn't isolated. There was great engagement that was actually taking place, inshallah. How do you feel about that, Imam Razawi? Is that okay?
I'm following your lead on this. I'm doing your ijtihad. As you wish to go forward, I am with you all the way.
Okay, Bismillah. So I think a good place to perhaps start with is the Amman message. Maulana, what do you think? I think that's
Risalat al-Amman.
Yeah, the Risalat al-Amman.
I think that's a good place to start, especially within the modern day context. It's not that old, and at the same time, it's something which has been signed by the vast majority of scholars across the various different denominations. So not just Shia-Sunni, but we've also got Abadi, we also have Zaydis. So we've got quite a mix of different people, and I think it's very important. Islam isn't one prism. It's quite colorful in many ways. So I think why don't we start off on that? Or if you want, after that, we can go through the historic, chronological kind of understanding of how things came together, to be honest, and why I believe anyway, we're probably living in the most polarized times, even though we should have gone forward. 43 days later, we should be more open-minded. But in fact, we've actually regressed from 1,000 years of Islamic civilization. But anyhow, I think we can get into the nitty-gritty of that, but I'll bounce it back to you. And as you wish to begin, let's Bismillah and begin.
Bismillah. So with our viewers, we would just like to share the 3 points of the Amman message, really. This is widely accessible on their website. And I think it's a good foundation for us to perhaps start. And I'm just going to perhaps read the first one, summarize the other two, and then there's key signatories actually to this. Perhaps the first point is the most pertinent point, in which they say, whoever is an adherent to one of the 4 Sunni schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and the 2 Shi'i schools, Ja'fari and Zaydi, and the Ibadi school of Islamic jurisprudence, and the Zahiri school, is a Muslim. Declaring that a person is an apostate is impossible and impermissible. Verily, his or her blood, honor, and property are inviolable. Moreover, in accordance with the Sheikh al-Azhar's fatwa, it is neither possible nor permissible to declare whoever subscribes to the Ashari Creed or whoever practices real tasawwuf as an apostate. Likewise, it is neither possible or permissible to declare whoever subscribes to the true Salafi thought as an apostate. Equally, it is neither possible nor permissible to declare as apostates any group of Muslims who believe in Allah and the core tenets and the teachings of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The other two are perhaps expanding on the first point. But Maulana, pushing that back, how do you feel about that point? Do you think that's encaptured everything?
Well, I think I've got mixed feelings on this.
Okay.
First and foremost, because in the 21st century, we shouldn't be giving statements like that. We should have already come together. If you go back at least to the first 1 or 2 centuries of Islam, at least before, in fact, the Khawarij, what you found was that you were either Muslim or you weren't. There were different ideas, different ideologies. Within the first couple of years after the death of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you saw that there are 2 groups that formed. And then after that, you had the Uthmaniyya that formed, you had the Shia Ali that formed. And then as things begin to develop historically, you don't find them doing takfir of each other, even though they may have had differences of opinion on the basis of the political leadership which was in place. So 1400 years later, and I credit the Jordanians, especially King Abdullah, for doing what he's done, and his uncle, of course, who's also a peacemaker, who has been a peacemaker. So the Hashemites, as they should be as well, as descendants of the Prophet, they're the ones who should bring the communities together. And I'm very happy that they have done. Again, I think that this was agreed upon by everyone, but I still think there's a bit of a restriction which is there. And we can open it forward, because ultimately speaking, there are more than just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sects within Islam, one of which is now extinct anyway, or at least the Maktab of Zahiri Maktab is no more in existence. So, we're going back to the time of basically Spain, Andalusia. So the Zahiri Maktab was famous in Andalusia, but after Ibn Arabi, it just ceases to exist completely. So I think that there are many makatib which have come up and which have gone down. In the same way, the ones which are surviving today, it was patronage that they got from the Abbasis. There were multiple other ones. So I think the school of law doesn't define a Muslim. We've got to look at theology, but at the same time, I think it's sufficient to follow the principles of the Quran, which is essentially that person who believes in Tawheed, and then after that, the finality of the Prophet, as the seal of the Prophet. And I think that is what defines a Muslim, of course, believing in the hereafter, doing good deeds, as the Quran says. So, and I think for now, this is a good start, but I think it needs a bit of expansion if we are going to be inclusive and not exclusive to an extent.
Yeah, and I think this goes back in 2005, so it's about 16 years ago. So I went through the signatories, and it's quite interesting. So it's a very broad spectrum. A couple of names that not surprised me, that were interesting. From Pakistan, we have Mufti Taqi Uthmani, who's from the kind of prominent Deobandi Maktab, who is a signatory. Dr. Yusuf Qardawi, who is a prominent Muslim scholar. And then we had the Sheikhs of Azhar, and at that time was Sayyid Ali Tantawi, Sheikh Ahmed Tayyib at that time, who was a president. And then we had some interesting people from Germany. A lot of them were Turkish scholars who kind of signed up to that. And like you said, I think if things had progressed from then, maybe some of the points that you mentioned perhaps would have been included. We had Dr. Winters, Abdul Hakim Murad from UK, actually, who was a signatory to that. So I think that was a much needed step. Alhamdulillah, just to ease the waters. And from there, I would just like to link it to Azhar itself, which is interesting because Azhar has its origins in the Fatimi Caliphate, named after Zahra. built in front of the masjid and the maqam of Sayyidina Imam al-Hussein radiallahu ta'ala anhu. The maqam is very blessed, although there's many people contest that, there's a few different places where the maqam is. And I was reading that Azharis have this history where the Fatimid time they had brought the noble head of the Imam over. And one of the things that sticks to me is Imam Sha'rawi, who was a famous Imam past 30 years ago. He used to say that the reason I got my maqam was because of cleaning the gutters beside the Masjid of Al-Hussein, and by giving my service there. And someone who's from the subcontinent, we often think the love of Ahlul Bayt was maybe not as much in non-Pakistanis or people of other areas. But when I went to Egypt, they loved the Ahlul Bayt. Sayyida Aisha bint Imam Ja'far Sadiq's there, Sayyida Nafisa's there, and the Ahlul Misr cried actually for her to stay and not to leave. So I think Azhar is very prominent. And then in particular, just if you could elaborate, which we discussed, was Sheikh Shaltut. His whole was a Jama'at al-Taqrib Bain al-Madahib that he kind of had established. So what are your kind of thoughts on that? And how do you feel that was a step between this engagement of intellectual tradition?
And I think that particular period in time was quite an important one. So we're starting off from the late part of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And you had collaboration that takes place, and especially with Sayyid Jamaluddin Ablani, who was a link between Najaf and Egypt at the time, or at least the seminary, the Shia seminary, and Al-Azhar. So with that, I think things then begin to develop. Now, what he was, what he is, I'm not going to discuss that. We've got his biographies. You can look at it. Some people say he was born in Afghanistan, some say he was born in Iran. Whatever the case is, the fact was he had the ear of all the biggest leaders at the time. He was the one who advised Mirza Shirazi to give a fatwa that brought down the British Empire's tobacco, the famous tobacco ruling, which destroyed basically a huge enterprise in the Middle East. But at the same time, he was also a mentor to Muhammad ibn Abduhu and others as well that followed. So the grand muftis of Al-Azhar also were his students. So in that respect, he was a bridge between two, you could say, two important schools. And I think the way that things were developing, especially amongst the ulama of Lebanon and Al-Azhar, it was going in the right direction. But when I've asked privately, it's always been that because of this Wahhabization that was taking place in the region, it kind of put the brakes on almost. And then after that, you find that with Arab nationalism, and after Gamal Abdel Nasser, you find this kind of like a state run almost. So I think that where it could have been, it didn't go. I think it was developing well in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But I guess after, I think from the 70s onwards, and there seems to be a decline, or at least a stagnation within relationship. And I think up to probably Faisal of Saudi Arabia, he was quite open-minded, but then after that, what you find is a more rigid kind of approach. So because the Middle East is all interconnected, I think things began to stagnate. But hopefully you're seeing a bit of a revival now. And I think that, with this declaration between the Pope and the Grand Mufti, and now the Pope visiting Najaf as well. And then at the same time, I remember a couple of years ago, and Al-Azhar sent a waqf as well to Najaf to meet Sayyid Sistani. So I think that there is a development which is going on, but I think it's going to take a bit more push before that development takes place. But I seem to be answering now, so I'm going to put it back on you. What do you think? Do you think it's a good thing? Which direction are we going in? And do you think we can actually go forward and develop on what has been done in the 20th and 21st century?
So the 59th fatwa of Sheikh Shaltut was interesting. I think that was an important bridge. And I think Azhar is an intellectual tradition. It's not based on high emotion and sentiment. And in any kind of well-established university, you have chairs in Harvard, you'd have the chair of certain subject or certain subject. And I always think to myself that why does Azhar not have a chair of Shia studies? And
which it was meant to, by the way.
yeah, which was, and it fell through. And if you go to most universities, I mean, I'm talking from my own Sunni perspective, so I'm not going to say anything from the Shia perspective. But the Sunni perspective, a lot of the teachers who teach, it's usually a rad ala hada, or, you know, it's very kind of, it's very polemical. Whereas if the chair of study is a Shi'i who is traditionally trained in the seminaries of Najaf and Qum, and he comes over, and then there's this intellectual kind of engagement that takes place. I think that fosters really good relationships, and even for students to be very open, because one of the things that I think is that we have a lot of questions, but sometimes we're not brave to question them because we may offend others. And I think if the chair of Azhar was established, I presume, and even in my days of Azhar, when we talk to students there, we would say if we had a chair of Salafis, for instance, the first lesson would be very emotional, and, you know, again, all of those questions which have been troubling, you know, our minds, or, you know, that have been there. But then you would see after 2-3 lessons, you know, you would have a much more fruitful engagement. So I feel the first time for a lot of Sunni scholars, when they meet Shi'i scholars, you know, it's as if they're still stuck in that first lesson, even they're about 60, 65 years old, because they haven't had that kind of safe space in which to intellectually challenge each other. I think that's actually very important. And if you, because Alhamdulillah, I have had that. When I went to Iran, interestingly, I met Ayatollah Ja'far Subhani in Qom, and he pulled this book out. He had wrote a book of his correspondence with Sheikh al-Azhar, and he starts reading stuff to me. He goes, you know, we sent ulama and delegations, and, you know, I was unaware of this, and I was very shamefully saying, you know, I am graduate of Azhar, but I should know more. But we had a very good conversation. So, and I was quite open with the ulama there. We had that discussion. But bringing it to that point, because I brought a local scholar to you once a couple of years ago, and when we sat together, the first thing that this particular imam, he had those early burning questions on imamat and khilafat and all of this kind of stuff. So I think most of the imam, not all of them, but a lot of them are still in that first lesson in which, you know, they want to get stuff off their chest, and then they can actually build. So I think if there was a chair in Azhar of Shi'i studies, and perhaps somewhere in Qum or in Najaf, a chair of Sunni studies, where you can have this. When I went to Iran, I was very surprised with Iranian students and how their understanding of the different groups within Sunni Islam are, you know, the different reactionary and modernist groups. And they came to me with very precise questions, and I thought, mashallah, you know, it just seemed they've had this sort of engagement and encounter.
That's very interesting, because I remember in Qom there used to be at least 7 or more students from Al-Azhar every year who would come and exchange. I don't know if that was reciprocated or not, but I do know that there was a whole exchange process which was there. So you had students who would come and they would sit through the lessons just to see how it was. They had a number of courses as well for them to understand. So I think you're right. I think you're completely right in that. I think that in this modern day and age, there should be a chair. You know, I remember at the Vatican, they were saying, why don't you guys establish a Shia chair here? If we can establish one in the Vatican, then surely we can establish one in Al-Azhar. By the way, there is a Sunni chair in the Vatican, just to let you know.
Is there? I didn't know that. A Sunni chair in the Vatican?
Adnan Mokorani is the chair of over there, and, you know, he's been he's been doing very well. So I think, yeah, so their view with us was, hey, why don't you guys establish a Shia chair here? Which makes a lot of sense, you know. So I think moving forward, why not? Why shouldn't we have a chair? As part of the agreement anyway in the time of Shaltut was that there should be some kind of a chair or some kind of a recognition where we could sit down and talk. And I think you're completely right. But if we go back in the history of the subcontinent, for example, pre-partition, it is very famous for people to have their opinions, but they sat together. I was reading something where you had, what was his name? The one who wrote Al-Faruq, Shibli Nomani.
Yeah, Shibli Nomani.
The Shibli Nomani would sit with Shia scholars, or the great Shia scholars of Lucknow, for example. They would sit together at dinner and eat together. So, and it didn't break anyone's marriage or anything like that, like some people say. So they would sit together, they would discuss together, but obviously they had their own opinions.
Yes.
So I think that the differences before were intellectual differences, which shows the character of these individuals. And I think that as long as the intellectual differences, that shows that you are an intellectual, that shows that you're somebody who's polished. But when you take your differences and you make them personal, I think at that stage, then that shows somebody who's unrefined, somebody who's not a scholar. Scholarship is meant to make you humble, such that, we can put our differences to one side. Not all scholars agree on many things, but there shouldn't be a personal issue. So when I read that once upon a time, at least in India, there was a time where people did, and I spoke up to Maulana Shahid Raza about this as well. And he said, we used to, back in the day, there was no issue with us. We used to go to Majlis, or we used to sit down, with Shia scholars, and, we're more liberal in that respect than today. Or, for example, you'd find in places like Pakistan. Why that is, again, that's a completely different terrain. But from people I've heard, it's, it's pre-7980, post-7980 that takes place with the introduction of martial law. But prior to that, I've heard that it was still okay. People would sit down, people would discuss. They would, if they had any problems or any problems in the communities, I think that they would come together and then resolve their problems. So, I think that it is important that there should be an avenue whereby we can come together, sit together and resolve our issues. Because at this moment in time, at least in the United Kingdom, there is really no official body where imams, potentially Menab could be one, but other than that, there isn't really a body which is recognized, where if in times of difficulty, we could sit down and say, look, there's a problem, there's an existential threat, or there's a political issue, or there's a social issue, civic issue. Why don't we sit down together and resolve this issue? And I think if something like that was formed, and I think if even 2 or 3 or 4 people were able to come on and say something, I think that would be extremely, I think empowering for our community. I think they'd feel that, okay, finally these guys have got some kind of ecumenical dialogue. Regardless of what took place in Northern Ireland, if you look at the Protestants and the Catholics, today there's still ecumenical dialogue amongst Christians. There's still ecumenical dialogues amongst Jews, Hindus, and so forth within themselves. So I think it's time now that we also, at least within the country that we live in, at least within Scotland, and we're well ahead of many other places. So I think if we could have some kind of an official ecumenical board, I think that would be extremely important. And I know for a fact that people are watching and they're looking for what we're doing. And I can guarantee you there's probably people from, government and so forth listening just to this conversation. I know some of them did promise they would want to listen because they want to see, can these guys really get it together? And I truly feel that we can revive some of that togetherness that was once upon a time that made Islam great.
Okay, a couple of points there, Maulana. First one is of this aspect of ecumenical work. I think that's interesting. If, like you mentioned, if different Christian denominations, and we all know the wars that were fought between these groups in Europe and tore the whole of Europe apart. I mean, literally, they were at each other's throat, but today they can smile and drink tea and really come together on very core issues. I mean, Christian Aid, the big charity, stuff like that, which is kind of beyond why can we not do that? And do you think there is an appetite? Because I feel a lot of educated folk, Muslim folk now, are quite tired of this kind of, inward fighting, narrow-mindedness. They've been brought up that Sunnis X, Y, and Z, Shias X, Y, and Z, and they're just tired of it all. And for some that I know have just put whole of religion behind them, because it's fueled this kind of hatred. So I perhaps think there are educated folk who think, beyond Shiaism is not limited to, a goat eating 10 juz of the Quran. Some of these fanciful stories that we hear. Shiaism is a much more respected tradition. And the reason why I say that is I know very credible Sunni teachers who do not say it out in open, but they're studied their kalam and mantiq and falsafa with Shi'i trained scholars, but they won't say in the open, and I understand why they won't, just because how situation is, and they would do that. So I think people are coming forward and actually thinking that's actually important. There's one of the scholars of Azhar, when he would talk about the Sheikh Abdullah Darraz, he would say that if the oppressors are supporters of each other, then why can't the oppressed be supporters of each other? Again, tying it in with the point that you've actually said. Now, going back to the ulama of Farangi Mahal, which is interesting because subcontinent Sunniism is very interesting in this context because we have a strong Farsi tradition. My honorable father, when he studied Dars-e-Nizami in the 70s, he knows Farsi. He knows Farsi well. The Farangi Mahal know Farsi. In fact, I was reading earlier that when the English of the East India Company, when they wanted to be accepted in scholarly circles, a lot of them had to learn Farsi and read Hafiz and Jami and others just to kind of converse. So I think that's very interesting. So how do you understand subcontinent Farangi Mahal Sunniism? Because Persian was very important. I mean, even perhaps more important than Arabic. Our scholars still often say to us that you should study Karima or get your basic. Farsi did. So do you think subcontinent Sunniism has this rich cultural engagement, perhaps, compared to other Sunni forms in different parts of the world?
That's quite a deep question, so I'll have to just unpack some of that. I think that pre-partition there was, and I keep on mentioning that because the same problem that I see in Pakistan is not in India.
Okay.
That sectarianism is not in India. Maybe slowly creeping in, but it's not accelerated as it is in Pakistan. Farangi Mahal, again, were Sufi background.
Yep.
The vast majority of kalam is in Farsi. So whether you're a follower of Muinuddin Chishti, which all of them will have to speak Farsi, if you want to go to the cortex, or Mir Sayyid Ali Hamidani, or Jalaluddin Surposh Bukhari, or, for example, Sohrawardi, whoever you may follow, the fact of the matter is that Farsi as a language of tasawwuf is very important. But I think more than that, there are three fundamental languages now, of four actually, of the Islamic world. And the four languages are Arabic, Farsi, Turkish, and Urdu. If you want a comprehensive understanding, you need to be able to speak all four of them, or at least have an academic level of all four of them, and because some of the greatest scholars are from these four languages. So I think that there is a lot of parallel. There is a lot of, and you mentioned, of course, people studying from one another. Some of our great scholars, even within the Shia tradition, they have pages of, for example, ijaza from Sunni scholars. That finished, I believe, on Ayatollah Marashi. But if you look at Ayatollah Marashi himself, he's got so many, for example, hadith and riwayah, all sorts of stuff from Sunni scholars, which means that there was quite a collaboration which was going on. And I think you're right about the Al-Azhar as well. I remember I had two very senior scholars from Al-Azhar come to me. We were in the corridor once, and I won't mention their names because they asked me not to. They're in line to very big positions. And he said, look, in Bidayat al-Hikmah, Allama Tabatabai says the following about wujud. Can you explain that? And we had a good discussion. I explained it to him. But, having taught Bidayat al-Hikmah myself a number of times. But the fact was, it took me aback. And then I asked him, I said, why are you studying this? And he goes, no, we study Shaykh al-Sadr. We study Allama Tabatabai. Those are the two people that, in fact, in the Maqulat, we actually look at them, we study them. And, similarly, if you look at some of the durus of Sayyid Kamal al-Haydari, for example, he's mentioned a lot of contemporary Sunni scholars who he suggests people to study and to look at. I don't think it's a bad thing. If you go back to the Baghdad of maybe, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you did find that Sheikh Mufid, one of the greatest Shia scholars, who really is, I guess, one of the founders, the pillars of the Maktab itself. He used to study in both schools. So he was studying within the Mu'tazilis, and he was studying within the Shia school as well. And there is a stark difference, by the way. I know academics tend to think that Mu'tazilis' heritage is taken over by Shias. That's not the case. We have our differences with the Mu'tazilis, but the fact is that there was dialogue. There were conversations which were taking place, and it was easier to go and study. There was a time where you could just go to a Sunni maktab or a Shia maktab and just study, and they'd be like, yeah, fine, no problem, come in. We're willing to teach you. So if you look at, for example, Abbas Teherani, who's one of the great scholars that we have on Rijal and otherwise, some of his permissions that he has are from very top-notch Sunni scholars. So he's basically got ijazah from Shia scholars and then Sunni scholars on the basis of some of the hadith which he's narrating. And that heritage is finished now. In this day and age, I don't think that there's hardly any Sunni or Shia scholars who would have ijazah from each other. Especially even within the spiritual dimension, even within the tasawwuf chain. There was a time where you would go to all and want to get ijazah, but now I don't think so. I think that there's a limited number of people who may have ijazah even on the basis of tasawwuf. So I think it's important that some kind of revival does take place, because there is a heritage which is going back. Yes, there's been polemics, even amongst the Sufis, but at the same time, you see the evolution amongst certain Sufis. Take Ghazali himself, where he started and where he finished. It's polar opposite. So so I think that it's important, if we're going to go ahead, that it's important to get other perspectives. There are certain things that we may have in terms of the dua of the Imams, which may not be accessible openly. There are certain families who still have that. Within the Sunni world, you have the Ba'alawiyah. They have a lot of good stuff that they've inherited. Similarly, there's a lot of Sa'ada families within the Shia who have certain things which they wouldn't really divulge out, especially in terms of awrad, dua, the supplications, munajat, and so forth. So I think it's not a bad thing to get along, to talk, to have conversations, to learn from one another, because it only strengthens a person. It doesn't weaken you in any way. I believe it only strengthens you.
And this encounter engagement is interesting, because even if you look at the Sunni Sahasita, Bukhari and Muslim actually took from Shi'i narrators. And I've dug out one example in which Al-Dhahabi mentions, there's a narrator that Bukhari mentions, Abban ibn Taghlib, and Dhahabi says he was a staunch Shia, but he was truthful. So we take actually his hadith. And then Azhari scholars actually wrote a book on this, Al-Tawassal al-Madahib al-Islamiyya fil Hadith, how this engagement was actually taking place in Hadith, which is very interesting, because the Sahih Sita for Sunni Islam are almost kind of pivotal. It's our second source after the Quran, which the Sunnah is actually based on. But again, it was mutual intellectual engagement. This was happening actually. You have your aqaid and whatever, but, this is intellectual, and this is how we're going to keep it. One of the great people that I read on, this was 12 years ago whilst doing my first master's, was Ali Shariati. Now, I know he's a bit of a modernist. I don't know how he's perceived within. I know he wasn't within the Shi'i ulama. I know he wasn't a traditionally trained scholar actually as such. You can perhaps have more to say on that. But I read some of his works, and his biography was very interesting. His father was a big scholar.
Yes.
And so I think it's Ali Hamida or something who wrote who wrote Shariati's full kind of biography. I found that very interesting. He was an Iranian sociologist trained in France, and he comes back, but he is rejuvenating the tradition And this is what I liked about him. I mean, I know he was a modernist, and you know, modernist scholars pose problems in any tradition, even within Sunni Islam. We had Abdu and all of these guys, but still, there's good that you can take from him. But I remember reading two of his talks, and I think he was a very fiery speaker. He would give his dars at the Husseiniya. One was on Abu Zar al-Ghafari, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. One is Fatima is Fatima. My goodness, honestly, I was really baffled how he's able to. We do the same in the sense when we're relating old and revered figures. We talk about their life and they lived this, but we disconnect them from our time. And what Shariati was trying to do was, especially in Fatima, is that, okay, Fatima's come, she's gone now, but how are we going to make our daughters Fatima? And this is the real actual interesting part. So one of the things about Shariati was a huge fan of Iqbal.
Yes.
Iqbal wrote Farsi. He wrote yes, there you go. Yeah.
Book on Iqbal. So I was reading it just today.
Okay.
So here's a book, and Shariati writes about Iqbal. And as you know, Iqbal is famous in Iran. They call him Iqbal Lahori. And, you know, even Iran's supreme leader is meant to be a specialist, actually. And he's written on Iqbal. So Iqbal actually is more appreciated as Farsi. Kalam is more appreciated in Iran than it is within Pakistan, I believe. There's an entire library I've seen named after Iqbal. So yeah, so there we are. So there's cross-pollination going on. But sorry, I was cutting you there. Sorry.
No. I just find it interesting. So he wrote this book, Ma wa Iqbal, which is, I think, We and Iqbal. But I'm just going to share, and Shariati is, I mean, I want your thoughts on him anyway, because I haven't really understood him. But what does he say? He says, I mean, obviously, he's a huge fan of Iqbal, and he says, Iqbal loves Rumi. He was like the Bergson. He sung his faith like Nasir Khusro. He fights with the colonialists for the liberation of Muslim lands, and then he brings actually his poetry and like you have mentioned, and my dad often mentions, when I read Iqbal, I can't make sense of him. I have to go to my dad for the translations actually on Iqbal. And then Shariati also takes a Rumi, as Rumi is obviously this international figure, but I just found that interesting, because Shariati is living in a very kind of hot point in history. There's a lot of kind of changes are actually happening.
It was interesting because around about that time you have something which is known as liberation theology.
Yes.
Liberation theological movements. And I guess it was more of a political movement. This is why you find people like Ali Ayatollah Khomeini and Maududi. They were very close friends, although in terms of theology they were quite different. But there's one of our friends that we know in Chicago. He's an imam, and he said that, you know, it was in the 70s, and there was an issue that had taken place with one of the students who was arrested at the time because they were kind of more political than they should have been. So they went to Maududi, and they thought, you know, we'll try and pull a line on Maududi and, you know, say to him that, you know, Khomeini has instructed us or something. So they went down, and, you know, they said, oh, yeah, no, you know, we're supporting Khomeini. And he looked up and he goes, son, I knew Khomeini before you were born. You don't need to pull a fast one on me, basically, was, you know, the rough mafhum of what it was. So he says, look, you know, we've written to one another. So I think in those days, it wasn't, you know, I think they were looking out for the ummah, which was really the main.
Yes, yeah.
Idea of ummah, which is not anymore. So they were looking out for ummah. But coming back to Shariati, see, Shariati, you know, I guess the more conservative scholars hate him, detest him. But at the same time, you have scholars who like him. And my philosophy has always been that you should read everyone. And I'll be honest, I've actually benefited from reading some of Shariati's work. Though I know people like Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who's again a great scholar, hates Shariati in many ways. But there are other scholars who, you know, do like him, and everybody has their own opinion.
No, of course.
But I think I think the angle that he's coming up from, he's a sociologist. And I think sometimes to be able to understand people, and their sentiments is important. And people will say he was one of the pillars of the revolution. You know, though maybe people may not like his methodology, but the fact of the matter was that he was also giving lectures in Hussein Rashad, same with Mutahiri, same with Hussein Nasser and others. So I think, you know, I don't think that, you know, personally, I think it's a good thing one should read him to get a wider understanding. But yeah, there are two schools. There are two schools of thought, one which cannot detest him from the ulama, and others who rave about him and love him and, you know, have written commentaries on his work. Now, should knowledge be restricted? I don't think so. I don't think I don't think there's anything that he's saying in there which is shirk or kufr or anything like that. I think what he's saying is quite ma'qul many a time. So I think it can be learned. He's non-sectarian. He doesn't pull a sectarian narrative, and he's coming like an eagle is on the basis of the ummah. So it's not I'm looking at my people or my community only. He has real pain for the ummah. And I think some of the great scholars have actually had pain for the ummah. So they transcend almost, you know, so you mentioned Iqbal. Iqbal is read by everyone. Why is that? Because he doesn't compartmentalize to say Sunni, Shia, or whatever it may be. He's looking at the ummah. People like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he's loved by all. He's looking at the ummah. Or there's other people who actually look at people, humanity, the ummah, wider than that. So I think the more wider you are, I guess the more appreciated you are. There's some great people who are read today, listened today, their works are translated. Nobody has a clue what their background may be even. People like, I've got a book here, Henry Corbin, read by everyone. You know, you don't ask what denomination he was, what sect he was, what religion he was. You just read his books because it's kind of an overview. Toshiko Azitsu is a great intellectual. But even today now, if you look at even within the academic world, it's becoming very polarized. It's like a one lens kind of my way is the highway. And I think if a person has pain for the ummah at large, they remember today. You look at some of the great scholars who actually thought about the ummah at large. It wasn't just about one sect or denomination. It was about the whole. And I think that kind of humility and that sacrifice for the whole is important. Because when you develop that, that's only when you're remembered. Look, even today, go to the subcontinent. Who are those scholars who are revered by all? Tariq Jamil. Why is he revered so much? So he's a Deobandi, but why is he revered by even Shia? Because he talks about unity. He talks about the ummah. You know, you may have other scholars today, people like Allama Talib Johari passed away. Many Sunnis who came to his funeral. Why? Because he looked at the ummah, looked at Quran. He didn't go into polemics. And he was a good scholar in terms of Quran. So, you know, you do have various scholars who are famous, who are well respected, because they look at people's welfare, they look at the ummah. They're not looking at one kind of line. And I guess, does polemical debate have a place at this moment in time? No, maybe amongst some of the scholars it may do. But in the awam, does it? I don't think it does, because the awam don't understand. So I think in the awam, when you're discussing with the awam, there should be things that bring us closer for our betterment, for the community's betterment, for the community at large betterment. You know, if we're getting along together, if a household is, then you can then go to your neighbours and start getting along with them. I think it's a good thing for Scotland if we were to come together, because it's not just a good thing for Shia, Sunni or Muslims. I think when two denominations as powerful and as big as this Sunni-Shia dynamic has come together, the benefit is for all of Scotland. And more than that, the knock-on effect is on a neighbouring country as well. So those are just a couple of things. I think Ali Shariati is amazing in the way that he presents his material. And his book on Iqbal, I was reading, in fact, because recently I've been getting more into Iqbal. You know, there was a book which was given to me by a friend of mine, Professor Peter Oakes from UVA, Virginia.
Okay.
And he's an expert on, well, he's a Jewish theologian. So here's a Jewish theologian. I went to UVA, gave a lecture, and he gives me this book. He said, I'm going to give this to you as a hadiah. I said, what is it? And it was on Iqbal. So I thought, why is he giving it to me? But I looked at it and I thought, falsafa khudi. Okay, let's have a read. I read the first 2 pages. I was blown apart. If you give me 2 seconds, I've got the book lying just next to me.
Yeah, of course.
And I will just get out of the way for 1 second just to grab the book. But there was a particular line. And my God, Iqbal just blew me away. I was like, wow, who is this guy? What's he talking about? And if I can find it. So this is the book by Iqbal. And this is obviously an English translation. And
the first one, Khudi, is interesting because for Shariati, that was something that was really attracted to Iqbal again, about the Khudi.
Yeah, and Iqbal knows. Look at the way that he starts off. I'll give you a quote here. Socrates concentrated his attention on the human world alone. Tim, the proper study of man, was man, and now the world of plants, insects, and stars. However, unlike the spirit of the Quran, which sees in the humble bee a recipient of the divine inspiration, and constantly calls upon the reader to observe the perpetual change of the winds, the alternations of the day and night, the clouds, the starry heavens, and the planets swimming through infinite space. As a true disciple of Socrates, Plato despised his sense perception, which in his view yielded mere opinion and no real knowledge. However, unlike the Quran, which regards hearing and sight as the most valuable divine gifts. So slowly he just breaks down some of the Greek philosophers to say, hang on a minute, look at Ibn Rushd. So for example, then he goes on to Razawi, Ibn Rushd. Looks at the human ego, looks at the Mu'tazila, looks at the Ash'ari movement, goes on to Kant. In Germany, rationalism appeared as an ally of the religion, but she soon realized that the dogmatic side of religion was incapable of demonstration. And then he develops the entire European argument, and then he goes on to conclude on the preserved tablet. So, so you know, the guy is amazing. So it gripped me. I was like, whoa, hang on a minute. You know, this isn't Mullah Sadra. This isn't Ibn Arabi. This isn't Ibn Sina. This guy is one of the most underrated philosophers. You know, so you mentioned Iqbal, and I've taken aback, fascinated by some of his stuff, and I do wish that people would read more of Iqbal.
Iqbal, I mean, one of the other aspects that were thoroughly enjoyed, I guess, from both Sunni Shi'i is his tasawwuf, his spirituality. He very famously says that I came to the heights of Cambridge, but yet the cold water of England didn't stop me from my tahajjud prayers. And when I was in Cambridge, I did see the flat. There's a plaque outside that says that this is where the famous philosopher and poet Iqbal stayed. And our ulama know his ash'ar from on top of his head. One of the scholars who was quite contentious, Maulana Khadim Hussain Rizvi, who passed away. Of course, there's issues there, but you know why he got famous? Iqbal. He knew Iqbal inside out. I mean, he would read his ash'ar, and that really captivated him. And this is again what I love about Iqbal. He was a clean-shaven man with a mustache, but he is someone who's revered by the most religious fundamentalists to the most kind of secularist. I mean, everyone, especially in Pakistan, really reveres Iqbal, and that shows you the kind of magnitude actually of someone. I suppose, like some of the poetry that you've read, Iqbal had mastered Western philosophy. I mean, when he's talking about Plato and, you know, sense perception and not kind of believing that. But then he comes back, and like you said, he's very critical of the West, but he's got this dard for the Ummah, this great pain, which really translates into Shariati and many of others who actually picked him up. Yeah, so yeah, I like Shariati. He passed away when he was 43, I think, and he was buried next to Sayyida Zainab, I think, in
Damascus, yes.
Damascus, which is interesting. When I went to Iran, I did go to Mashhad and do the ziyarah there. And one of the things again was I had my Azhari garb on, but people really respected me and welcomed me into the maqam, and I was really astounded by the size of it. I'll be very, very straight with you. I mean, subhanAllah, it's just sheer huge. So, and I always said to the people who came with me that although there's difference, but at least you can appreciate art and architecture, which is the Islamic civilization in itself, and Iran is kind of very, very rich in that. I think it'd be nice to perhaps finish on the topic of travel, because Sunni and Shi'i both express their love of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt and the Sahaba through art and architecture. So, what Muslim countries have you been to, and what are some of your kind of favorite mosques and maqams that you visited?
Well, it's interesting because about 2 weeks ago I wrote an article on sacred art.
Okay.
And the need for sacred art as an expression of the divine. But also within the Islamic world, what you find is that the manifestation of Tawheed is found within art. Art can be sound, art can be recitation of the Quran, art can be the mosques. If you look at the mosques, if you go to some of the best mosques in the world, whether it's in Damascus or whether it's in Isfahan or whether it's in Egypt, you find that on the dome, you find certain symbols, and those symbols symbolize the archetypal realms and reality. So I think that there is a synthesis, and if you look at where Islamic art developed, there were three civilizations that developed, which come under the Islamic civilization. There was the Ottomans, there was the Safavis, and there was the Mughals. All three of them actually originate from the same place. They're all the same, ethnically the same. And they developed some of the most beautiful art. So if I was to say, okay, the places that I've been, Damascus is beautiful. If you look at some of the art in Damascus, it really is a continuation of the Abrahamic reality of monotheism. And with that, if you go to Egypt as well, you find some of the kind of like, if I use this term, Idrisi knowledge, because Egypt is pre-Abraham. Egypt goes back to Nabi Idris alayhi salam. So there's that kind of pre-knowledge, which is then that mixes in with the kind of more contemporary stuff, be it Ras al-Hussein or be it Sayyidah Zainab. And then after that, I guess, where else I've seen, obviously Iran and Iraq, both. If you go to the Haram, the shrine of Imam Ali alayhi salam, it's Sheikh Baha'i was the one who, according to the planetary constellations, developed it. And this is why they've redone everything, but they don't touch Imam Ali's shrine, because Sheikh Baha'i, according to Najum, set all of the rooms in the various buruj. So you'll find that the entire structure for those people who know Najum, you'll see that it's based upon the constellations. And in fact, they would say that depending on which room you go into, it's actually specific for a particular knowledge. It would accelerate your understanding because it basically complements a particular star. So, you had the likes of Sheikh Baha'i. Then you go to Isfahan, you look at the beauty. The Safavis were really good at developing the various mosques. Turkey itself, has a particular, I was in Istanbul not too long ago, and you look at some of the beauty over there. However, at the same time, India as well, Pakistan, India, they have that as well. However, the new stuff that's coming out, without mentioning any countries, but you can guess which countries. Whatever they build, it's not sacred. It doesn't give that smell of sacred art, Islamic art. It's a good building, no doubt about it, but it doesn't have it. You can't just go in there. It doesn't appeal to you. If you look at the sacredness even of the Kaaba, you look at the geometric patterns, you look at the exact numbers of, it's phenomenal because there are geometric formulae that come from that. So, whoever, you can build a nice mosque, no doubt about that. The fact is, though, that have you thought about what you're building? Does it correspond to something? And, and I think that the countries that still have it today are Yemen. Beautiful, you go to Yemen, beautiful place. Obviously war-torn now, but you've got Yemen, you've got Egypt, you've got Syria, you've got Iran, you've got parts of Iraq, you've got the subcontinent, rich. You've got Afghanistan, go to Herat, for example. Where you go to where Moinuddin Chishti's from, for example, you see some of the beauty there. You go to Bukhara. So I think that the Islamic world still has some beautiful things, including all the way down to Andalusia. You go to south of Spain. But though Charles V converted much of it to Christianity, but you can still see, you know a Muslim place when you see it. So, up to all the way to Portugal. And funnily enough, even Venice, people go on their honeymoons to Venice. They don't realize Venice was a port for Islam to come through. Europe only came out the Dark Ages because of ports like Venice, where Islam decided to come through there. So if you look at some of the symbology, even within Venice, you can still see that Islamic art there. And I think that, it's important that we know about these things. We know about a heritage. 1,000 years of them developing that within the space of about 70 years or 80 years. People don't know anything about it anymore. People don't discuss it anymore. But let me ask you a question. And I think nothing hard. But what would you say is the way forward for us? If in a nutshell, you could put a conclusion to today's discussion. Because I know we've got to open it up to questions if there are any. But let's say if there was to be a conclusion, what would you say that conclusion is? How would that conclusion look? In your heart of hearts, what do you hope that can happen? And how do you hope we can go forward?
Ooh. Maulana, I thought you said you're not going to ask me a difficult question. I think there has to be engagement in the top leadership. Because if the top leadership is divided, I think that trickles down. If the top leadership, if there is dialogue, it doesn't necessarily trickle down, but it's a starter of actual something. And for me, I think speaking is the most important. I mean, if I were asked you which two nations have the fiercest rivalry, you'd probably say India and Pakistan. Man, even they have back channel discussions. I was reading General Asad Durrani. He was a retired ISI who wrote a book with Dolat, who's a former raw agent. It's a 100-page book, so interesting, looking into the dynamics. 1 minute India and Pakistan, the media, the politicians, everyone. But yet the key players in both countries, which is the military and the intelligence, they have back channel discussions, even during Modi's time. Modi's national advisor, security advisor, has many times kind of spoke to Pakistani intelligence. So what I'm trying to say is that you need to have discussion, no matter how difficult a topic becomes. You need to have discussion. A good example of this is two examples. This is personally. One is that crazy guy in London who was funded with his own channel, and he said a lot of garbage, as if he's representing the entire Shi'i tradition. And that was I think that was very targeted. But I watched some of his stuff, but then because you've got those discussions, when you ask Shi'i scholars, they say, listen, he's got nothing to do with any of us. He hasn't studied in any of our houses. He hasn't been accredited from any of our imams. And then I share that message with the imams that I know, that guys, calm down. It's not, it's someone who's creating fitna. And then we've got the Imam Tawhidi sitting in Australia, another, and someone who's trying to kind of poke at the emotions, especially when it comes to Sunni-Shia relations. So I think if we begin to talk and we have dialogues, I can pick the phone up, and I've done that a few times. I said, with you, I said, Huzur, I've come across this. Is this what it is? And you said, no, listen, it's not like that. It's a bit more complicated. These are the nuances that you need to understand. I was like, okay, fine. So I think that kind of dialogue, and we've discussed about Shaltut and a few others, I think that needs to actually happen. So in the context of Scotland, I think that's very important. I think perhaps we're here for the second year, inshallah, because of that. And although we like to thank Edinburgh ISOC for that, but there is a willingness from both of us for this discussion. Otherwise, if there's no willingness, the event doesn't take place. And number two, I think, is art and architecture. I think if the Scottish government, if Robert can fund a wee trip, we're all going to go to Isfahan and appreciate each other's just the art and architecture in the Islamic world. I began to read Sayyid Hussein Nasr on sacred art.
Yes, it's amazing.
Really blown away. I mean, this is a stuff which is not in our darsiyat really, but Nasr, when he talks about the domes, the structure of the circle represents the divine, the motion around the Kaaba when we're doing tawaf is that structure of unity. And then when we read about Prince Charles and his Islamic gardens and, how they were developed on the baghs of Iran and others, that really blows you. I mean, that is Islam in its pure civilizational form, which really, and the arts have really what brought Islam, brought people to Islam. You mentioned Andalusia. Andalusia is so beautiful. I was reading actually on the Moriscos, the Muslims who stayed on after and, who had communities and how they were tortured and persecuted, but even kind of stayed in Spain. They saw that as their kind of homeland. So I think engagement and I think traveling together, and I've said this to you, I've said, if SABS make me an offer in which they take me for the Arba'in, I am more than happy to go there because
we'll make you an offer then. Let's do it. If this year Arba'in opens up, then by all means do come with us. I have personally taken Sunnis to Iraq. First time for many of them. I've taken people from the Qadiri, from the Chishtis, and in fact 2018 December in the Haram of Imam Musa ibn Ja'far, there were more Sunnis in the Haram than Shias, 70 to 30. I've never seen that in my life before. And it was also helped by the Mutawalli of Abdul Qadir Gilani. He's like, don't worry.
Okay.
So there is a very good relationship, and take it from me, I give you an invitation. Inshallah, we'll sort it out. You come with us for Arba'in this year. We will take you to wherever you want to go. Just bear in mind that there will be 15, 20 million people. But you will get full service.
I want to just explain to the viewers what Arba'in is, and maybe, and I know you've been I know we need to finish, but maybe we can finish on this, your experience of the Arba'in. I've heard it a lot, and some folks who have come back have said it is very life-changing, the whole journey. Just people sitting there on the path, happy to give you food and do your khidmah. It's just brilliant.
I've been going since 2014 continuously, 2013, 2014. And, I've been there when there's been tension in Iraq and otherwise. But the overflow of love that you get there. So Arba'in really is the 40th. So it represents the 40th after the martyrdom of Imam Hassan. And, you have people from across the world who are flying in. If I was to say everyone is Shia, I'd be wrong. There are groups now, especially in the last couple of years, there are groups from India and Pakistan of prominent Sunnis who are coming. They also go. We all pray together. There's no distinction. It's not like you go to the Haram in Mecca and you're worried that as a only Shia praying there, somebody may come and hit you on the back of the head. So it's not one of those ones. So, you can, and you'll see that many a time. I can show you so many witnesses from the Sunni faith, from Sunni who are from London and otherwise, who we took many years ago, still do, still come. And you go there and basically you're marking the Arba'in of Imam Hussein, which symbolizes Sayyidah Zainab coming to see her brother. Here's a sister, here's the granddaughter of the Prophet. She's been in captive. She's gone from Kufa to Sham. Yazid set them free. Here Sayyidah Zainab now wants to go and mourn for her brother. And as she begins to go and she gets to Karbala, this entire walk, we can't obviously do the whole walk because of borders and boundaries and so forth. From Najaf, from Imam Ali, we walk, and it's 80 kilometers. And people in 2 days, people who can't even walk, my elderly parents who generally couldn't walk, last year they did the Arba'in walk within 1.5 days. They walked day and night. They had about 2-3 hours sleep, and both of them, mashallah, they walked from Najaf to Karbala. And I have to admit, I don't do it every year, and I'm knackered because at that stage I'm flying in from the United States generally because of the whole Muharram schedule.
Yes.
So I'm on a completely different time schedule. I get that I'm knackered, having gone to maybe 7 or 8 cities and so forth, and all across the world in different time zones. So by the time I get to Karbala, I'm tired. So I think twice I've done the walk, but no more than that. And then after that, generally, I go to Canada direct from Karbala. So, but it's amazing. And 2 years ago, I think it was 2019, is when SABS as a whole group went. And, all of our youth from Edinburgh really were there. And it was so empowering to see them. And, you can see people changing, because the most important thing is khidmah. Every step of the way, you've got people willing to serve you. They don't care who you are. They don't care what background you're from. They don't care if you're Arab or Persian or Indian or Turkish. And on the night of Arba'in, you see all of the flags which are coming. And the Iraqis will stand there crying. And you see, this is the flag of Canada coming in. And everybody will be crying and they'll saying, look at Imam Hussein. People from Canada are coming to him. Flag of Ireland will be coming. Flag of France will be coming. Last year, Scotland and France's flags were together as we walked in to the shrine of Imam Hussein. And they will come on the mic and they'll say, oh, people know that people from Scotland and France are coming. And then people begin to cry. And, it's phenomenal how you go into the shrines of Imam Hussein, into the shrine of Abul Fadl Abbas. You go to the shrine in Najaf. You go to the shrine in Kadhimiya, in Samarra. You go to Baghdad, wherever it may be. And you see such unity. You don't otherwise see it. But the final thing I'll say is I remember the first time ever when I was walking. I was with a group of people, some people from Dubai, some people from East Africa. And I remember when I was walking, there was a young boy who came to me. And in Iraq, it's just the biggest, you could say, restaurant, free, 80 kilometers of food, right? So people think that, we're putting on weight by the time you get to the end of it. But this kid comes to me, he's very small. I think he must have been about 7 or 8. He didn't have any shoes on. His feet were blistered. And he came forward and he said, can you take a tissue, a handkerchief?
Okay.
I looked at him and I thought, son, what are you doing? Go back to your parents, kind of thing. And he looked up and he said, my parents have been killed by ISIS. I am an only child. I wish I had food to give you. All I have is a tissue. Please take this so on the day of judgment I can say to Rasulullah, I did something for Hussein. And at that moment, we all began to cry. It was the most emotional, part of that journey to see a child with that much dedication. But anyhow, inshallah, this coming year, if everything is free, once you've got your vaccination, inshallah, we'll go.
Yeah, no, I really want to, because that reminds me of in Hijaz during the Ottoman period, how Hajj and Umrah used to be, where people from different parts of the world would join the caravan. They would go to Makkah, and then after Makkah, they would present themselves in front of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, when we go to Umrah, we have to be careful when we're doing dua in front of the Rih. No one slaps us from the back and say to us, this is bid'ah or shirk. Whereas I remember reading Hazrat Bayuzdin Bastami Rahmatullah alayh, when he went to Umrah, instead of going Medina Sharif, he went back to his hometown and he goes, no, I'm going to meet Rasulullah because I want to, not because I came to Makkah and Medina is closer to Makkah. So he goes back. And again, he is someone who's shared this beautiful spiritual figure, and then he comes back and he presents himself into Medina Sharif. There's something about pilgrimage, traveling, that brings people together. And I was recently with some of these kind of Christian, the Christian denomination, Church of Scotland and others who. Protestant Reformation got rid of that pilgrimage, this or that, but even now they're understanding that this is so impactful. I went to, when you've been to Vatican many times, when I went to Vatican, it must be 9 years ago, and I was at the kind of on Wednesday, the papal audience, 150,000 people, Maulana. And, the cardinals are there speaking different language, and the Pope saying, thank you to the people from Brazil. And they're cheering. And, you can feel that energy. The Pope actually also said, thank you to Cambridge Muslim College. And, we were there kind of cheering. Yeah. The Pope said that to us. So I think dialogue and going together on traveling. And last and finally, I mean, one of the tafsirs that I've been reading is the Study Quran, and that's had a lot of positive and a lot of criticisms. But for my personal reading, one of the great things about it, it brings in some of the Shi'i traditional scholars, Allama Sayyid Tabatabai, Allama Tibrisi, Mullah Sadr, and you begin to appreciate the Quran a wee bit more from these different kind of perspectives. Okay, Alexander's here. I think that's time up for us.
I mean, I wish I could let you guys speak on for 4 more hours. It was an amazing conversation. But there are a few questions which I think would be really interesting to discuss as well a little bit. So one of them is, if I can find it now again. Yes, so you talked a little bit about the kind of the Sunniism and Shi'ism kind of in a geopolitical context, and to what extent is the split between Sunni and Shia just a geopolitical one, and does it make the sectarianism more or less, or is it not really an issue in that sense?
For me personally, I think, I mean, differences have been there with all theological sects, Islam, Christianity, but I think the particular Sunni-Shia one has, because it fits into the narrative geopolitically for some people, so they have exasperated it. I think that's a big problem. I mean, I came across Muhammad Mukhtar al-Shinqiti, a Mauritanian scholar, traditional Sunni. Around a couple of years ago, he wrote an article in Arabic talking about Sunni-Shi'i between engagement and disconnection. And he argues that the differences have really been pushed up because it fits geopolitically and because of the politics of certain countries and just the way that things are actually running. And he's a Sunni Mauritanian traditional kind of scholar. So I would say yes, because the reason why I say that, because polemics has always been there. You can open up Sunni Shi'i books, you can pick up Razi, you can even pick up Allama Tabatabai. They are responding to each other in an intellectual way. But when politics comes in, then I think things change. And people in both sides who are not educated, they are overcome with fury and anger and emotions. And I think this is where the problem happens. And like I mentioned during my talk, then we have experts on Sunni-Shia relations and, you know, intelligence reports being written 15, 16 pages. How do we stop these guys blowing each other up? And I'm just thinking, you know, you're telling me that? Shinqiti argues that before Iraq was taken over, it was relatively peaceful. Shinqiti argues, you look at the Shi'i Muslim, Shi'i Sunni interactions in Pakistan and the subcontinent have been very kind of engaging. So there's something more to just the differences, I would say.
Do you have anything to add?
No, I would go along with that. I would agree completely. I think much of it is exacerbated by the geopolitical situation. When the situation is better, relationship becomes better. And when it deteriorates and there's a power struggle for the region or for preeminence in the region, the situation flares up again.
Okay, thank you for that. We also have this other question. So, Imam Razawi, you mentioned that unlike past scholars such as Iqbal, many modern scholars are actually much more polarized in their articles in the book. Do we know when this shift happened and why?
I don't think I said that, to be honest.
Oh, then maybe that's what the question said. I think when you said,
if you remind me of this, because
I think I only have the question, so I think it was when you were kind of talking about the book by Muhammad Iqbal, and you were kind of praising him, how he was talking about the Ummah and humanity, and how compared that for some reason, from what I understood as well,
Right.
it's a bit of your point that it happens less, that scholars talk about the Ummah as one humanity.
You know, the problem is when you live in a monastery, all you'll know is the four walls of that monastery. If, as Sheikh has already said, when you go to Cambridge, you come back to Pakistan, you know, you're studying in different places, you're meeting different people, you're having different conversations, then it actually increases your threshold of understanding. And more so when you see other people, you can empathize with them as well. If I don't know you, how can I empathize with you? But if I know that you have 4 children and you also have issues, for example, with family, or let's say, for example, with earning a living and so forth, I come to know you as a human being. I can then empathize with you. So similarly, many of the great scholars of the past took time out to knock on each other's doors, just to come and just to see how they were. You know, obviously we can't do that in lockdown. However, hopefully, once this is lifted, I will definitely be going to Imam Rabbani's house and just knocking on his door, and you know, having some desi chai and, you know, hopefully some nice vegetable samosas.
Alhamdulillah. And likewise, I mean, when I was in Edinburgh, I came down to the masjid there during Muharram to listen to some of his talks. I thought I'd sneak in at the back so he can't see me, so he can carry on with the Sunni bashing. But to my very disappointment, it wasn't. It was a very intellectual talk. He was talking about education and, you know, Baytul Hikmah, 9th, 10th century Baghdad. But like you said, when you knock doors, when you go there, you're welcomed. You realize, oh my God, you know, they're not cursing Sunnis all the time. You know, they are talking positive and intellectually. Yeah, it's important.
Thank you. And it's, yeah, maybe a bit of a confusing question, but thank you for the. So we have here also. So while, you know, we've been discussing kind of on a very academic, intellectual level, and we've shown that it is possible to come together and agree on points and kind of have this idea of unity. But what is a way to kind of connect on a less academic level to the common person? What is a way to do that?
I think, look, tolerance is very important. So unity doesn't mean that you stop praying the way that you pray and I stop praying the way that I pray. I think there's a fundamental issue when it comes to unity. No, it doesn't mean that you stop believing in what you believe in and I stop believing in what I believe in. I think the most important thing is that we appreciate each other. And I think the word we're looking for is coexistence. We coexist with each other. So on the basis of the average person, when you meet somebody, don't have negativity in your heart. It's like, look, you know, people talk about pre-partition, Hindus and Muslims sitting together, eating together, being together. Now with Pakistan and India, it's not much about a Hindu or Muslim. It's India, Pakistan, when 2 people come together, it's almost as if, you know, they've got this kind of negativity inside of them, kind of thing. Or even when a Muslim from India meets a Muslim from Pakistan, you can see the hesitation for 2 seconds because there seems to be a bit of a rivalry. I think if you can take out the hesitation of, oh my God, are you Sunni? Oh my God, are you Shia? Do you do that, for example, when you meet your Christians, Jewish, atheist friends? You don't do that, do you? So I think in the same way, when you develop a relationship with somebody, it's based on the person. And in fact, I would feel more comfortable if when the prayer time came, I need to pray. Or for example, you know, just to be open about certain things, to say, look, you know, it's the month of Ramadan, you know, it's time to break your fast. Please break your fast. You know, Shias will do ihtiyat for 10 minutes. You know, we'll break in 10 minutes time because of ihtiyat for the sun to go down completely. But you please break your fast. And, you know, I remember I said that to one person and he said, listen, if I wait 10 minutes, it's not haram on me. I'll wait for you. And I felt, you know, very touched by that gesture. So I think, look, you know, I think as far as it's concerned, we just have to be normal. Normalization means that, look, you know, if it's time for prayer, if I say to you, look, please can I pray? That's what I do all the time. You know, I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I was in Land of Palace. I prayed 4 of my prayers there and they had no issue whatsoever. I said, it's prayer time. They took me to a room. There were prayer mats out there. And I said, how comes you guys have got prayer mats? He said, don't you know that we've got so many visitors? And it was in a meeting, and, and there we are. You can easily go and you can pray there. And I think that that's powerful. And I think if I can go and I can go to a church, or I can go to a Christian institution and I can pray there, why can't the same level of kind of being together happen within Islam itself? I should be able, and you know what, and I'll give you something actually, last year. So in fact, when we were together last year in Edinburgh, after that, we went to Glasgow, and I was looking for a place to pray. So where did we go? We went to the Sheikh's father's mosque. And I remember knocked on the door, and his father came out and he said, look, you know what? You pray, we'll go upstairs or whatever it was and do our meeting. And he said, no, please. I said, no, you pray. And they went to the other room quietly. And in fact, I think they were standing outside or whatever it was. I can't remember now. I was feeling so bad because it was cold. And we prayed, and, we did all the mustahabats, and we're thinking, mashallah, let's go and just max it out today. Not realizing, look back, somebody was standing outside and said, okay, let's finish quickly, go outside. And the most beautiful of receptions. And you look at it and you think, if that is the akhlaq of a Sunni leader, then why is it today that we're not together? We should be reciprocating that. So, when people do say, can we learn from the elders? I think we can definitely learn from the elders. I think the elders have the secret still, the embrace to pray. And to the extent that, people, fathers, some of the people who were there were saying, look, we'll feed you. Let's go and feed you. You've come from Edinburgh. You've come from, 45 minutes still, we'll take you, we'll feed you some nice biryani kind of thing. And that's Islamic hospitality. And if we can all apply just some of that hospitality, just forget denomination for a minute. Look at the prophets and see. Somebody comes, regardless of, Sa'il comes, Bismillah, come inside, sit down a seat. So if we just remember the humanity, just the average person, I think that's enough. You don't need to go into polemical discussions, theological discussion. What do you believe in God? I can assure you 99% of people don't even know what Jabr is and what Ikhtiyar is. There's no point even going into that, whether the Quran is created or not. That doesn't, it's not a point of argument for the average person. So I think let's forget those arguments to one side. Let's just bring out the humanity.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think unity doesn't mean we are holding hands and we're leaving each other's ways and adopting the others. I think that's a misunderstanding from a lot of people when, in fact, whilst doing this event, I remember I got lots of messages, what you're doing. And I always think, well, no one messages me when I'm doing interfaith work. But for some reason, when I'm discussing something with a fellow Muslim who's not from the similar background as me, there's more criticisms to that. So for me, what I would say is you should feel more comfortable. What should be the case, you should be more comfortable in sitting down with a Shi'i brethren, more comfortable than a Christian or a Jewish person, but it's not like that. For a lot of, from our side and from Sunnis, they easily can sit with non-Muslims and go to interfaith events and, God, Buddhists and Hindus and whoever's there. But the moment when a Shia brothers, they're like, oh, I find this uneasy. Can you see that contradiction in that? I just find that it's just, yeah, people are probably suffering from cognitive dissonance or something. So, as what Imam Razawi said, I think eating together. So we usually in Glasgow go to the West End when we're invited for like an iftar together, and we eat together. Although there's long summer days and I can't wait for an extra 10 minutes. But yeah, and I think it's beautiful. So I think little initiatives like that, just eating together, and we do that at mosques. We do that with interfaith groups. So why not?
Do you have time for maybe one more question? I realize it's half past, but we've got one or two more questions. Is that
Alexander? This is what happens. I don't know if you're aware, but in our subcontinent, they say when you bring two Maulvis together who are good speakers, they're never going to stop talking.
Is that a bad thing? I don't know.
Yeah, your question be great.
So one person asked, so I think we've all heard the phrase, oh, I'm not Sunni or Shia, I'm just Muslim. But it just so happens that most of these people who say this tend to be Sunni. And while it's a beautiful sentiment, alhamdulillah, what can be done to recognize that this is a type of privilege and the outlying feeling that Shia people often face, especially in diaspora communities such as Edinburgh, where the majority are Sunni? Open to both.
So can you repeat the question? I didn't quite understand.
So no, essentially, sorry. I hope my audio with the mask is not.
No, your audio is fine. It's just the structure of the sentence.
Yeah. So essentially, how can we this kind of Sunni privilege of being able to claim, oh, I'm not Sunni or Shia, I'm just Muslim, and this idea of kind of overgeneralizing and kind of ignoring the differences. How that is a kind of a Sunni way of saying things. How can we combat that in a place where the majority of people are Sunni, in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in these types of places? I hope I'm trying to interpret the question in a more understandable way.
If I understand it correctly, and the fact when Sunnis say that we're just Muslim rather than saying Sunni-Shia, my understanding of that, experience of that, it's usually people who, who are kind of quite educated, university graduates perhaps. And for me, that's an indication almost like, from where we're just tired of these Sunni-Shia debates and, X, Y, and Z. We're just tired of all. So we've stopped labeling ourselves as Sunni-Shia. We're just going to say we're Muslim. Not always the case, but from my experience, this is what, and this is why I started with the discussion with Imam Razawi. I said people are tired of this continuous bickering, even within your own context, wherever you come from, you will realize that, and just people kind of want to move on. And we're living in the most advanced place in the world. We've got first-class education, but yet when we're talking about our religious intelligence is very low. When it comes to Sunni-Shia, we're still talking about what our great-grandparents who were perhaps farmers in little villages, we still have that same understanding, whereas, contextually, we're living in perhaps the most advanced place in the world. So I think people are tired of that narrative. And what me and Imam Razawi tried is that we're giving a narrative where we are reasserting that there are differences in Sunni Shi'ism, but this difference doesn't mean you cut each other's necks, but the difference is one of engagement in which, and that's why we've tried to tease out through Iqbal and Shariati and Bukhari and others, that although there was differences, there was this kind of engagement. But I totally understand why people say that, and it's due to perhaps some of the trauma, the baggage, and where they've come from, that they're absolutely tired of seeing, even on the media, and the media perpetuates it a lot. Each time there's a bomb in Iraq and it's like Sunni, Shia, Shia, Sunni, and I think people are tired of all of that. So that would be my understanding of it anyway.
Well, I think it's important that this middle group of people, the intellectuals, the professionals, they need to be kept engaged. And I have no problem with somebody saying, I'm just a Muslim, because ultimately we are just Muslims. What Sunni Shia represent is an interpretation. Look, you all believe in Tawheed. You all believe in the Prophet. So we're trying to extract what the Prophet wants from us. And that leads to interpretation. If our Prophet was here today, there would be no labels. Everybody would say, we follow him. It's very simple. So I understand what they're saying as well. I understand where they're coming from. I understand they're tired. I understand that some of the most successful, most professional Muslims in Scotland, they don't want to fall into this kind of polemical discussion. But I think that they also have a responsibility, because if you are a majority, you have rights on the minority and vice versa. So I think it's very important that both groups show hospitality, good etiquette to one another, to help one another. I remember once upon a time, now going back to my university days, about 20 years ago or so, a long time ago from now, but I do remember the month of Ramadan. In those days, it was completely different. You had the brothers from the Maghreb, you had Yemenis. We used to sit together. There was, they knew our timings. They knew exactly how we prayed. I remember I was standing there for prayer. One guy comes and he gives me a leaf. So it made me smile. He says, I know that you can only prostrate on natural substances. People think that Shias pray to a stone. That's not the case. We can't prostrate on carpet because it's synthetic. So he came forward. He'd gone outside. We were in a cabin at the time. He'd gone outside. He pulled out a leaf or whatever it was. He brought it to me and he said, look, this is the first time I've seen you. Here it is. No problem whatsoever. Let's pray together. And we prayed together. And there was no issue in that. So I think we've regressed from there, from how it used to be, that we were accepting of each other. There seems to be a regression that 20 years later, people are hiding, people are not, forthright in what they believe in. People see religion as a form of conflict, which I don't think it is. I think it's meant to humanize people. And I think the most important thing is the idea of service to others. So that is in a nutshell what I would say.
I mean, thank you both so much. That's pretty much. I think we've gone far enough over. I just want to thank you both so much for agreeing to come again. Hopefully, it definitely won't be the last time. Hopefully, next year, next year's committee can maybe do something similar. Hopefully, the situation will be improved then. I also just want to quickly thank the Edinburgh Interfaith Association, who actually managed to set up the Zoom meeting and who are kind of running the Zoom. So that was really, that saved me yesterday. I was panicking. So I just want to thank them. Do you have any last points, any last comments you want to make?
Yeah, I would like to thank Edinburgh ISOC for taking the very brave step, especially last year. I always say, although I'm from Heriot, I'll be honest, Edinburgh has probably the best societies in Scotland, if not in UK. It's so internally diverse and they're very open and trying new things out. And I really enjoy that. And I've been in touch with you guys for several years. And I think from last year's event, it seemed that, people had an appetite. And following, I think, and this is something I would like later maybe to discuss with Imam Razawi, that forward, what we try to do every year is not do the same thing. Yeah, we Sunni-Shia, yeah, let's smile, and it's going a bit into depth, looking into that, and we hope perhaps if we can come together next year, we can choose a certain topic. I really enjoyed when Imam Razawi was reading some poetry, so maybe we can read some poetry together, and just kind of enjoy that. Enjoy that. That kind of almost recreate that engagement what our predecessors almost went. So yeah, I'd like to thank you, Alexander, for all the time and contacting, and obviously to Imam Razawi, to all the team in SABS, who mashallah, who are doing a fantastic job.
And likewise, just to thank you all, especially Imam Rabbani. I know the pressure's on him as well. For coming and speaking to a Shia. So thank you for all the effort that he's put in. I think it's important as well because he's put in a lot of effort to come and speak. And I do pray for his safety and well-being. Also, the ISOC, you're probably one of the most diverse and most accepting ISOCs I've come across. I think that Cambridge ISOC is also mixed, but I don't know now, this is going back 20 years ago, 15 years ago, but you are probably the most diverse, most accepting ISOC. And again, to Ian Stewart for helping in this, and everybody else who's helped in this. I just pray we can continue this. It's a very good thing. We go forward. Perhaps we can have a discussion on Ibn Arabi and Tasawwuf.
Oh yeah. So Ertugrul is very popular. I think Ibn Arabi mashallah. Amen.
Thank you again. I hope Carrie can end the stream